Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that's a little less philosophical and a whole lot greasier. That's right, medieval junk food. Believe it or not, even in an age without burger joints, soda fountains, or late-night kebab stands, people still manage to indulge their cravings. Some of their snacks were surprisingly tasty, others downright questionable, but every bite was soaked in the unmistakable flavor of the Middle Ages. Before we dig in, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the content I create. And don't forget to drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is over there. I love seeing how far this little community reaches. Now, go ahead, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soothing background hum, and let's slip into tonight's story together.
In an era where most culinary delights were dubious and tasted rather unappealing, apple fritters stood out as a genuine triumph. These golden brown morsels were sweet, piping hot, and possessed a touch of delightful peril, much like any significant decision made during the medieval period. Essentially, they were the closest medieval equivalent to a modern-day donut, albeit without the sugary glaze and contemporary hygiene standards. The anatomy of a medieval fritter. What, then, constituted a fritter in those times? Apples were, of course, a primary ingredient, though not the pristine, blemish-free varieties found in today's supermarkets. Instead, imagine small, tart, irregularly shaped fruits, likely gathered from an orchard behind the local tavern. Perhaps even pilfered from a neighbor's trees. These apples were then roughly chopped and enveloped in a coarse batter comprising flour, eggs, and occasionally ale. Given that water sources were often unreliable and ale tended to uplift spirits. Then came the frying process, a dramatic affair in the 14th century. The oil, typically pig fat, was repeatedly used until it likely had a storied history of its own. While one might generously call it a flavor enhancer, the result was a snack that was hot, wonderfully crispy, and strangely addictive. A fritter, fresh from the pan, was a moment of pure bliss, crisp at the edges, soft in the middle, and carrying the faint risk of minor burns. Sweetening the deal. If you were fortunate enough to be wealthy, your fritter might be dusted with imported sugar, a lavish commodity that also served as a display of social standing. For the common folk, a drizzle of honey or spiced syrup sufficed. Either way, it was sweet enough to divert attention from the rest of one's diet, which frequently involved cabbage masquerading as various other dishes. Fritters were quintessential street food, readily available at fairs, after religious services, or on market days when a sweet indulgence was desired, and a bit of grease on one's attire was inconsequential. Children adored them, adults relished them, and even birds attempted to snatch them. They were entertaining, quickly consumed, and just decadent enough to make one forget the pickled root vegetables awaiting at home. And yes, sometimes they were overcooked. Or the apples were more sour than sweet, or the batter possessed a peculiar chewiness. The unsung hero, cheese curds. Yet, when they were well prepared, they were truly exceptional. A single bite offered a glimpse into why people endured medieval life. If apple fritters were the medieval rendition of a donut, then cheese curds were, in a way, the medieval popcorn. Bite-sized, subtly squeaky, and wildly inconsistent in texture, they weren't showy, didn't melt gracefully, and certainly didn't stretch. In fact, they did little beyond existing, and that was their perfection. To be clear, medieval cheese wasn't created with aesthetic appeal in mind. It was produced swiftly, consumed even faster, and expected to withstand arduous journeys, questionable storage conditions, and the occasional hoof print from a goat. Cheese curds were, essentially, nascent cheese, the initial fresh fragments before the cheese will solidified into a material sturdy enough for construction. These small clusters of dairy delight were a byproduct of the cheese-making process. Farmers would separate milk into curds and whey using rennet, a term that sounds sophisticated until one realizes its origin in the stomach lining of a young animal. Nevertheless, it was effective. The curds were lightly pressed, salted, and then, that was it. Cheese curds. Sometimes soft, sometimes rubbery, they occasionally squeaked against one's teeth as if endowed with personality. Yet, they were substantial, easily transportable, and oddly satisfying. In an era where a snack often meant stale bread or cold broth, curds felt like a victory. Monks favored them, travelers carried them, and children consumed them like confectionery. Assuming the cows had been obliging that week. They could be fried, crumbled over stews, or simply eaten by the handful, all while feigning indifference to the faint aroma of a barn. The humble turnip pie. Unlike many medieval foods, cheese curds didn't necessitate a grand celebration or feast. They weren't reserved for holidays or saint days, they were simply present, comforting, familiar, and mildly chewy. They were akin to that steadfast friend who always shows up, never over-delivers, but remains strangely dependable when everything else crumbles. Did they occasionally taste a bit off? Certainly, freshness was a broad spectrum in the Middle Ages, but with ample salt and enthusiasm, most people didn't voice complaints. Moreover, in a world devoid of refrigeration, one's culinary standards naturally adjusted. So, no, cheese curds weren't glamorous, but they were simple, nourishing, and just indulgent enough to qualify as a treat. In a pinch, they also proved excellent for bribing felines and small children. Let's begin with a fundamental truth: turnips are not dessert. However, in the medieval world, where sugar was a luxury, apples were not always in season, and creative desperation was a significant dietary component. Someone, somewhere, looked at a turnip and conceived the notion of a turnip pie. And thus, it was born. To be fair, it wasn't always dreadful. Occasionally, it was even quite palatable. Envision mashed turnips. Hopefully tender, combined with a touch of egg, perhaps some honey or dried fruit if the cook was feeling generous, then baked within a robust crust made of flour, water, and ambition. The outcome was, surprisingly, edible. At its best, it was warm, subtly sweet, and possessed that vaguely comforting root vegetable meats pudding essence. At its worst, it tasted as if someone had mistaken animal fodder for a baking ingredient and simply proceeded with it. The allure of the meat pasty. Turnip pies gained popularity for two primary reasons. Turnips were inexpensive, and a pie crust could conceal a multitude of flaws. Whether the turnips were overripe, undercooked, or suspiciously bitter, once baked into a pie with a drizzle of honey, it transformed into peasant cuisine with aspirations. Was it cheesecake? No. But it aspired to be, and in medieval Europe, aspiration held considerable weight. These pies were found at fairs, on feast tables, and in particularly enthusiastic monasteries where the monks had ample time and an abundance of surplus root vegetables. Some recipes incorporated spices, nutmeg if the abbey was prosperous, pepper if the cook was a bit chaotic. Occasionally, raisins made an appearance, only adding to the confusion. Nobles typically eschewed turnip pie unless they were slumming it for amusement or feigning solidarity with the common populace for political motives. But for everyone else, it was dessert. Sort of. More like an afterthought enveloped in pastry. And yet, despite its questionable logic, the turnip pie endured. People enjoyed it, or at least they didn't dislike it enough to cease making it. It was cheap, filling, and mildly sweet, which, for medieval fare, rendered it practically revolutionary. If medieval comfort food had a most valuable player, it was undoubtedly the meat pasty. A portable pie filled with seasoned meat, encased in a folded crust, and baked until golden brown or slightly charred. Essentially, it was a medieval hot pocket, sans microwave. But with a palpable sense of adventure. The brilliance of the pasty lay in its portability. One could consume it on the road, in the fields, or while observing a public execution. Whatever the day demanded. Enveloped in a thick pastry crust, it retained warmth for an extended period and protected its contents from dirt, vermin, and the occasional peasant sneeze. But let's discuss the filling. Meat, in this context, was a flexible term. If you resided near a manor or hunting estate, you might enjoy pork, mutton, or venison, actual, identifiable meat. If not, the options expanded dramatically: rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog, anything that once possessed legs or slithered could be diced, seasoned, and artfully concealed within pastry with plausible deniability. Spices were frequently employed to enhance flavor, or, more accurately, to divert attention from it. Pepper, sage, and garlic provided assistance, but they couldn't entirely mask the fact that the meat might have been resting for a few days longer than ideal. Still, in an era where refrigeration was a fantasy and lunch often consisted merely of bread and onions, a meaty pasty felt luxurious. The refreshing candied fennel seeds. There were even vegetarian versions, filled with root vegetables, leeks, or cheese for fasting days or the exceptionally devout. But make no mistake, the meat-filled pasties were the crowd pleasers. They were greasy, hot, and comforting. One didn't inquire about the contents, one simply ate and hoped the cook had been in good spirits. And yes, people sometimes marked the crust with initials or symbols to claim ownership, particularly among miners and laborers. In some regions, the crust was extra thick along one edge, allowing it to be held with soiled hands before being discarded to the spirits, or, more realistically, to rats. So, were they good? Often, yes. Were they enigmatic? Always. But that was part of their allure. You didn't eat a meat pasty for safety, you ate it because it tasted good, and you were prepared to accept the consequences. In a world where dental hygiene involved rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, candied fennel seeds were the closest medieval folks came to breath mints. Small, sugary, and subtly herbal. They were part treat, part digestive aid, and part dental hazard, all encapsulated in a single, oddly gratifying crunch. These tiny seeds were typically coated in a hard shell of sugar. A considerable undertaking in the Middle Ages, as sugar had to be imported, boiled, beaten, and poured by hand. This suggests a significant belief in the potential of these minute snacks. They were especially popular in noble households, where guests might be offered a small dish of them after dinner to freshen the mouth and, likely, to distract from any lingering mutton between their teeth. Honey cake, the medieval dessert darling. Flavor-wise, fennel seeds offered a robust, licorice-like bite. You either adored them or politely swallowed them whole, nodding in gratitude. The sugar coating helped. But that unmistakable herbal kick persisted, the kind of flavor that made you feel both refined and slightly bewildered. Candied seeds also served a practical purpose: digestion. People believed fennel aided in settling the stomach, especially after a substantial meal involving 3 types of poultry and an alarming quantity of mead. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of chewing gum combined with antacids, but with a greater propensity for chipping a tooth. And yes, they were hard enough to potentially crack a molar if approached too confidently. One did not chew candied fennel seeds casually. You tested one first, gently, bit down slowly, listened for cracking sounds, then committed. It was a risk-reward scenario every time. While the wealthy popped them like medieval breath fresheners, common folk occasionally obtained makeshift versions, usually involving honey, crushed herbs, and vague optimism. Not quite the same, but sufficient for pretense. In the grand hierarchy of medieval confections, candied fennel seeds were small but mighty. They didn't satiate hunger, but they left a pleasant taste in the mouth and conveyed an impression of sophistication, even if one was covered in mud and still had goose grease on their tunic. If medieval desserts had a prized possession, it was the honey cake, sweet, dense, and prone to adhering to everything except one's expectations. Honey cakes emerged as a testament to the ambition of medieval bakers, especially during times when sugar was a highly guarded commodity, often confined to royal treasuries. Honey was the common folk's sweetener, assuming they had access to bees, possessed the courage to climb trees, and didn't mind the occasional bee sting to the face. These cakes were typically crafted from flour, water, and generous dollops of honey, or at least what passed for generous in an era where spoons were more often used for squabbles than precise measurements. The enduring appeal of honey cakes. The result was a firm, chewy slab that could serve as either a delightful treat or a makeshift doorstop, depending on how long it had been resting near the hearth. Spices were sometimes incorporated if the household was prosperous or simply showing off. Nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon could lend a touch of flair to the honey cake. A flair meaning the ability to spark an entire village's conversation about your recipe for a week. Dried fruits were also added, provided they hadn't been pilfered by local children or fermented into wine. Honey cakes were a staple at feasts, festivals, and weddings, primarily because they could be prepared in advance, didn't spoil readily, and could endure being dropped, stepped on, or even hurled during a playful food skirmish. They also served as gifts, bribes, and occasionally, passive-aggressive gestures. As in, "Here, I made this for you. It's sweet, unlike your personality." Structurally, they were anything but delicate, many resembled compact bricks. Slicing them required a sturdy knife and the quiet hope that no one was observing your struggle. Eating them was simpler, just don't anticipate a fluffy bite. These cakes were designed for the rigors of medieval life, tough, durable, and coated in enough sticky honey to make your hands feel like you'd lost a wrestling match with a beehive. Yet, they were profoundly satisfying. They tasted of warmth and indulgence, like those rare moments when you weren't gnawing on salted barley or chasing rodents out of your pantry. They were joy encased in sugar, with just enough chewiness to count as a form of exercise. The unexpected delight. Fried fish skin cracklings. Fried fish skin cracklings, perhaps the most surprisingly delectable snack to emerge from a culture that also considered eel pie a good idea. These crispy, salty little strips weren't glamorous, but they were remarkably efficient. Waste not, want not, was the mantra, especially when dealing with fish that frankly seemed to be judging you. Let's be honest, no one intentionally set out to invent this. More likely, a frugal cook, faced with a mound of discarded fish skins, thought, what if we just fried it? A splash of hot fat later, and history was made, or at least something vaguely edible was born. Fish skin was abundant, particularly in coastal towns or near rivers where herring, cod, or whatever had been pulled from the water was processed on site. The meat went into the stew pot, the heads to the cat, and the skin was tossed into a pan of bubbling oil and sizzled into submission. The outcome was surprisingly addictive, a thin, crispy snack that crunched like a dried leaf but tasted of concentrated ocean. A pinch of salt elevated the experience, a hint of garlic or herbs. Well, then you were bordering on culinary excellence. These cracklings weren't merely tasty, they were practical, lightweight, relatively non-perishable, and rich in fat, precisely what a medieval body craved after a day of hauling firewood or defending sheep from another's flock. Soldiers carried them, sailors subsisted on them, and peasants hawked them outside taverns for a few coins and the satisfaction of offering intoxicated patrons something louder than their own conversations. Did they sometimes still have scales? Yes. Did they occasionally curl into odd shapes that made you question your life choices? Also, yes. But by medieval standards, they were downright elegant, crispy, flavorful, and unlikely to cause dysentery. The only real drawback was the smell. These things could announce their presence from 3 huts away. If you fried a batch indoors, your home would reek of Poseidon's laundry for a solid week. But you'd be forgiven because they tasted good. The humble and hearty, bread soaked in ale. When life presented stale bread and warm beer, you didn't despair. You created the most medieval snack imaginable, bread soaked in ale. Known by various names like soups or trench toast, this unpretentious creation was the original comfort food. Imagine French toast, but stripped of eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or any discernible joy. Here's how it worked: you took yesterday's bread, the kind that could double as building material, and plunged it into a bowl of ale. Not a sophisticated craft ale with notes of citrus and a hoppy finish. No, this was flat, low-alcohol medieval ale brewed in someone's smoky back room, with hygiene standards akin to a barn owl's nest. The bread absorbed the ale like a sponge with trust issues. It softened, swelled, and transformed from a jawbreaker into something vaguely edible. Was it tasty? In the right light, with a good mood and low expectations? Yes, somewhat. It was warm, bready, and carried the gentle bitterness of fermented grain, meaning it didn't actively offend the palate. This snack was especially favored by the working class. Individuals who lacked the time for multiple courses or cutlery but still needed calories that wouldn't put up a fight. Bread soaked in ale was quick, substantial, and just messy enough to feel like a genuine reprieve from daily chores. Sometimes people added extras, a sprinkle of herbs, a bit of cheese, or a fried egg if the hen was feeling generous that morning. On feast days, you might even find soups soaked in spiced ale, which essentially meant the cook stumbled upon a nutmeg shaving somewhere and felt inspired. And like many medieval dishes, this one served a dual purpose. It was both food and a means of stretching ingredients. Bread too stale to chew? Just soak it. Ale starting to turn? Pour it on bread and pretend it's intentional. Waste was for amateurs. The only drawback, it didn't travel well. Once soaked, the bread transformed into a kind of sloshy porridge cube. Eat it swiftly or risk ending up with a mushy sponge in your bowl and a 1,000-year-old food metaphor for disappointment. Still, for a chilly evening by the fire, nothing surpassed a slice of ale bread mush and a moment of tranquility. The refined, or bizarre sops in wine. If you've ever looked at a slice of bread and thought, this would be better submerged in alcohol, congratulations. You and the medieval upper class share a common inclination. Sops in wine were one of the more refined, bizarrely specific, snacks of the Middle Ages. A dessert, technically, or perhaps an experience. The concept was straightforward: take bread, ideally toasted or at least not entirely stale, and dunk it in wine. Not just any wine, of course, usually mulled, sweetened, or spiced wine, something warm, fragrant, and barely concealing the fact that it had been sitting in a clay jug since the last harvest. Once the bread was sufficiently drenched, it was served as a soft, spoonable delicacy. Nobles declared it elegant, everyone else quietly wondered if the cook had simply run out of ideas. This was not finger food. It was the kind of dish you ate with a spoon, very slowly, while feigning interest in lute music. It made appearances at banquets, late-night feasts, and those awkward dinners where no one wanted to discuss politics, so instead, they passed around soggy toast in a goblet. When prepared well, sops in wine were warm, comforting, and mildly intoxicating, a gentle conclusion to a heavy meal. The wine added richness. The bread provided texture, and the spices made you feel as if you were part of something far fancier than it truly was. When prepared poorly, it was simply wet bread in a bowl. No amount of cinnamon could mask the feeling that you were chewing on a medieval mistake. Sometimes dried fruits or nuts were added for flair, occasionally cheese, and, on rare occasions, a whole egg. At that point, it ceased being a snack and became a culinary guessing game. Peasants created their own versions, typically using cheap vinegar or ale instead of wine. It wasn't dessert. It was dinner, or breakfast, or whatever you could call a meal that left you both full and perplexed. Still, sops in wine had staying power. They were warm. They were filling. And they offered medieval people a taste of indulgence, even if it did resemble a sponge soaked in fermented regret. The enduring sweetness, dried fruit. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a highly prized treat. Sugary, exotic, and shelf-stable enough to endure an entire crusade, it wasn't your modern trail mix with convenient, resealable packaging. Medieval dried fruit had one paramount objective: to last. Taste was secondary. Texture was aggressively chewy. Dental damage was practically guaranteed. Let's begin with the basics. You had your usual suspects: raisins, figs, dates, and if you were truly extravagant, imported prunes. These were fruits that had been sun-dried, smoke-dried, or, in some cases, simply forgotten on a windowsill until they no longer qualified as moist. They were wrinkled, tough, and alarmingly dense, akin to an edible time capsule from the last harvest. The upside: dried fruit was intensely sweet. Really sweet. Concentrated sugars transformed these shriveled little things into medieval candy. Nobles cherished them, monks hoarded them, and children regarded them as rare treasures from the kitchen. The downside? Chewing them felt like battling your own jaw muscles. Figs came with seeds that doubled as medieval dental floss. Dates were sticky enough to glue your teeth together. Raisins lodged themselves in your teeth for hours. There was no such thing as discreet snacking. Still, dried fruit had its merits. It was used in pies, added to porridge, or chopped up and tossed into honey cakes to create the illusion of variety. Wealthy individuals might wrap them in pastry, drizzle them with rose water, or soak them in wine, as if attempting to impress a guest from Florence. For commoners, acquiring dried fruit was a special occasion, usually a holiday, a wedding, or the one day a year someone remembered you existed. When that happened, you'd eat it slowly, respectfully, possibly while hiding in the barn so you didn't have to share. Storage was simple. Dried fruit didn't spoil quickly and was often kept in small cloth sacks or clay pots. It did harden over time, yes, but that merely transformed it into a longer-lasting snack or potentially a projectile if you were creative and had younger siblings. In essence, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and faintly hazardous. It stuck with you, sometimes literally. The bold and hearty, blood-pudding ball. You wake up hungry. You crave something substantial, something fried, something that might offer a bit of a fight. Enter the blood-pudding ball, a medieval snack so dense, so daring, so unapologetically rich in iron that it makes modern sausage rolls appear like timid breadsticks. Born from the noble tradition of utilizing every part of the animal. These savory spheres were proof that nothing should go to waste, even if what you're not wasting is blood. Let's break it down. First, you collect fresh animal blood, usually pig, though, honestly, any blood would suffice in a pinch. You then combine it with oats, onions, suet, which is beef fat, and spices. Once that somewhat morbid concoction reached the ideal level of grim stickiness, you'd shape it into spheres and fry them in bubbling fat until their exteriors crisped up as if they had something to prove. The outcome? Dark, crunchy orbs of protein-packed sustenance with a rich, earthy flavor, which is medieval code for, you'll be tasting iron and mystery for the rest of the day. The practicality of blood pudding balls. These blood pudding balls were best savored hot, straight from the skillet, though they were sometimes eaten cold if one's hunger outweighed their aversion to congealed fat. Nobles might enhance them with a dash of pepper or serve them alongside eggs and ale. Peasants, on the other hand, were simply content to avoid chewing on boiled cabbage once more. Blood pudding balls weren't refined, but they were immensely practical, easy to transport, packed with calories, and remarkably filling. Consume 2, and you could skip lunch. Consume 4, and you were likely a blacksmith or attempting to win a dare. These snacks were common at fairs, markets, and roadside stalls where the air carried the mingled scents of livestock and ambition. They were particularly favored during colder months, for what better way to warm the soul than with fried coagulation? Of course, blood pudding balls weren't for everyone. Some found the texture unappealing, others, the very concept. But in a world where survival took precedence and flavor ranked somewhere around 12th, these humble, meaty morsels earned their rightful place in the medieval junk food hall of fame. Medieval pancakes, a humble treat. Forget everything you know about modern pancakes. These weren't fluffy stacks adorned with maple syrup and whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were thinner, tougher, and cooked in enough lard to prompt your arteries to consider early retirement. Yet, they fulfilled their purpose, and in a world where the alternative breakfast was a melancholy, thin soup, they were something of a luxury. Made from a simple blend of flour, eggs, and water or ale. These pancakes were poured onto a sizzling iron griddle generously coated in bubbling pig fat. No non-stick pans, no portion control, you simply ladled and hoped for the best. The result was a flat, irregular circle with crispy, browned edges and a slightly chewy center, the kind of pancake that could withstand a horseback ride and still be mostly edible upon arrival. Sometimes it was a little burnt, sometimes a little undercooked, and occasionally, charmingly both. The flavor depended on available ingredients. A splash of ale added a pleasant tang. A spoonful of honey was pure indulgence. A sprinkle of herbs or onions made it adventurous. But most often, it was just pancake and grease. Served hot and devoured as if one were fleeing a tax collector, these pancakes were universally enjoyed. Peasants, nobles, monks, merchants, everyone partook. Some layered them with cheese. Some dipped them in broth, and others simply rolled them up and called it a meal. You could eat them sweet, savory, or charred beyond recognition. And if you had leftovers, you'd stack them up and pretend they were cake or even armor. They were especially popular during Lent and other fasting periods when meat was forbidden. Pancakes became a culinary workaround, fried, filling, and somehow both humble and indulgent. Plus, they served as excellent vehicles for disguising other ingredients that had no business being in your mouth. And while they might not have been beautiful, medieval pancakes possessed remarkable staying power. They required no accolades, just a hot pan and a willing stomach. The delicate and deceptive medieval wafers. Somewhere between a snack and a sacrament, we discover the medieval wafer, a thin, crisp, suspiciously light biscuit that straddled the line between dessert and a dental challenge. Wafers were ubiquitous, found outside churches, at village fairs, in the hands of monks, and occasionally floating in your soup like a flat, holy crouton. Let's be clear. We're not discussing chocolate-dipped, cream-filled confections. Medieval wafers were composed of flour, water, eggs, and little else. If you were feeling extravagant, you might add a dash of honey or rose water, but most stuck to the fundamentals. A thin batter was poured onto hot metal wafer irons, pressed between two scorching plates like a medieval panini press. The outcome was something that looked fit for a communion ceremony and tasted like crispy paper with aspirations. Wafers were popular due to their portability, rapid preparation, and, best of all, their ability to be sold in vast quantities for a tidy profit. Vendors would set up outside churches on feast days, brandishing stacks of warm wafers at the faithful as they exited Mass. By now, "Sin later" wasn't the slogan, but it captured the general essence. They were often imprinted with religious symbols, floral patterns, or the vague likeness of a saint's face, depending on the iron mold and the baker's level of exhaustion. These designs didn't enhance the flavor, but they provided something to contemplate while chewing thoughtfully and feigning contentment. Structurally, wafers were delicate. They would crack if you merely looked at them askance and shattered if you attempted a clean break. Storing them was a challenge, and transporting them even more so, making outdoor consumption a high-stakes affair involving crumbs, wind, and regret. Still, they were beloved, light, crispy, and vaguely celebratory. Wafers were the medieval equivalent of treating yourself without completely disrupting your digestion or your finances. For nobles, they came piled high with fruit or layered with soft cheese. For everyone else, they were sold by the dozen at street stalls and consumed immediately before they disintegrated into edible confetti. The sweet and sticky, suck it. Suck it. Even the name sounds sticky. This medieval delicacy was essentially fruit that had been boiled into submission, submerged in syrup, and sealed in a jar like a sweet little hostage. Imagine candied oranges, dates, or ginger, coated in enough sugar to make your teeth tingle and your conscience whisper, "You shouldn't be eating this." But you did, because it was delicious. Probably imported, and you likely didn't have much else. Suck it wasn't for the everyday peasant chewing his seventh onion of the week. No, this was elite-tier snacking. The kind of indulgence served in noble halls or bestowed by the wealthy to convey, "I like you, but not enough to give you land." Sugar was expensive, and fruits weren't always in season. So suck it was reserved for special occasions, such as weddings, royal visits, or a random Wednesday if you were outrageously rich and utterly unrestrained. The preparation process was ambitious. First, you'd boil the fruit in syrup, perhaps honey, perhaps refined sugar if your spice merchant owed you a favor. Then, you'd drain it, allow it to dry slightly, and repeat the process several times. Because once wasn't enough. You weren't merely preserving fruit, you were declaring war on moisture itself. Eventually, the result was a glossy, jewel-toned bite of candy, chewy, intense. And so sweet it could probably be weaponized in sufficient doses. Some versions were soft and syrupy, served in ornate glass jars. Others were dry, rolled in extra sugar, and distributed as dainty little cubes of medieval hypoglycemia. But make no mistake, suck it conveyed status. It signified access to sugar, trade routes, and at least one servant dedicated solely to stirring recalcitrant mixtures. Suck-it trays were circulated after banquets like edible gold coins. Guests would take one piece, smile graciously, and immediately regret not grabbing three. As for commoners, they watched from the kitchen, perhaps surreptitiously licking a spoon if no one was observing. So, was it worth it? Honestly, yes. Suck-it was one of the few medieval snacks that genuinely felt like a dessert. It was rich, refined, and just extravagant enough to compensate for the fact that dinner had included boiled something. The ultimate medieval snack, fried eel. Ah, fried eel, the grand finale of medieval junk food. A dish so strangely beloved. It traversed from peasant hearths to royal banquets without once pausing to ask, "Wait, am I truly the best option here?" Yes. Yes, it was. Eel was ubiquitous in medieval Europe. Rivers and streams practically writhed with them, and they were easy to catch, inexpensive to cook, and when fried, surprisingly crispy. Slippery when raw, bonier than expected. And shaped like the antagonist in a fish-themed horror story, eel was nonetheless consumed by the bucket-load. Why? Because it was palatable, and more importantly, it wasn't turnips. To prepare it, you'd first have to catch the eel, usually at night when they slithered through shallow waters like sentient noodles. Then came the unpleasant task of skinning them, which was less like preparing a fish and more like wrestling a wet rope that was determined to cling to life. Once subdued, the eels were chopped, seasoned if you felt bold, and tossed into hot fat until the skin crisped up and the meat firmed into something vaguely appealing. The finished product, a crunchy, savory bite with a rich, slightly oily flavor. As if calamari and chicken had an identity crisis in a tavern kitchen. Fried eel was served at fairs, feasts, roadside inns, and, believe it or not, during religious fasts. That's right. Eel wasn't technically meat, so it slipped through the dietary loopholes like itself. Monks consumed it, nobles flaunted it. And kings had it stuffed into pies and paraded across banquets like the sea serpent it always aspired to be. Sure, it had bones, lots of them, and yes, it occasionally wriggled long after death. But if you could overlook that and the haunting sensation that you were devouring a villain from a cautionary folktale, fried eel was genuinely delicious. Crispy skin, tender inside. And just greasy enough to make you feel like you were living a little too dangerously for a Wednesday afternoon. Today, it might seem peculiar. Back then, it was a delicacy, a slippery little miracle that kept bellies full and menus delightfully odd. Mesopotamian dreams, divine telegrams. In the ancient world, Mesopotamia stood at the nexus of mystery and mythology. And nowhere was this more apparent than in their perception of dreams. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream wasn't merely a private, meaningless experience. It was a divine telegram, a supernatural email sent directly from the gods to the subconscious. And ignoring it? That was akin to leaving a message from Enlil unread, a perilous act. By approximately 2500 BCE, Mesopotamians had developed a comprehensive system of dream interpretation, meticulously recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform script. These weren't mere bedtime novelties, they were employed in statecraft, medicine, and religious rituals. Kings would postpone wars if a troubling dream suggested ill omens. Farmers wouldn't sow crops if they dreamt of a goat soaring across the sky. The world, they believed, was constantly communicating. It was your responsibility to listen with your eyes closed. Professional dream interpreters, known as Baru priests, were the ancient equivalents of Freudian analysts, minus the couch. They were trained in extensive libraries of omen texts, such as the Ishkar Zak, an elaborate dream manual that categorized dreams and their meanings in ways that were sometimes absurd but eerily precise. If you dreamt of eating dates, it was a positive sign. If your teeth were falling out in a dream, prepare for a death in the family. And dreaming of intimacy with a goddess? Well, congratulations. You were either divinely blessed or afflicted with extreme hubris. These ancient dream manuals weren't about mere conjecture, they posited a clear cause and effect. As if dreams were mathematical equations, A equals B. See a serpent? Expect treachery. Tumble from a rooftop? A lawsuit is imminent. The realm of dreams was logical, but it operated on a divine logic, far more enigmatic than human reasoning. Dream incubation in Mesopotamia. Yet, the Mesopotamians didn't stop at mere interpretation. They also practiced dream incubation. If a ruler sought guidance from the gods, he might spend the night in a temple under specific conditions, fasting, undergoing purification rituals, perhaps offering some incense, and await a revelatory dream. The belief was that certain environments fostered a stronger, clearer divine connection, reducing the likelihood of nightmares involving intoxicated goats. For the Mesopotamians, the dream world wasn't a puzzle to be solved, it was a territory to be navigated with prudence, reverence, and a substantial library of clay tablets. They believed the gods were perpetually speaking, you just needed to be asleep to hear them. Dreams as sacred texts in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egypt, dreams transcended mere nightly occurrences, they were regarded as sacred texts in motion. The Egyptians believed that dreams were messages from the deities, ancestors, or even one's own Ka, the spiritual double of a person. Every dream, whether benevolent or ominous, carried a specific intention. It could serve as a warning, a blessing, an instruction, or a source of terror. By the era of the New Kingdom, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE, the Egyptians had begun meticulously recording their interpretations in what would become some of history's earliest dream manuals. One of the most renowned examples is the Ramesside Dream Book, inscribed on papyrus and unearthed in the village of Deir el-Medina. This was no light reading. It functioned as a divine diagnostic tool, cataloging hundreds of dreams and interpreting each based on whether the outcome would be auspicious or calamitous. The logic, however, was not always readily apparent. For instance, if a man dreamt of consuming crocodile flesh, it signified that he would attain a high official position. Strange, perhaps, but in Egyptian cosmology, the crocodile was linked to the god Sobek, who embodied strength and power. To eat crocodile meant to assimilate divine attributes, a truly promotion-worthy omen. Each entry in the dream book commenced with the phrase, "If a man sees himself," followed by a symbolic scenario. These weren't arbitrary guesses. They were derived from centuries of ritualistic knowledge, personal visions, and temple traditions. The interpretations were often binary, marked as good or bad in red and black ink. If your dream was classified as unfavorable, it was time to burn incense and implore a priest for intervention. Priests in temple complexes, particularly those dedicated to healing deities like Serket or Thoth, sometimes offered dream incubation services, where supplicants would sleep within the temple walls, anticipating guidance or healing through visions. The aim was to establish a divine conduit through purification, prayer, and controlled slumber. This wasn't mere superstition, it was healthcare. Divination and theology interwoven into a single night's rest. Dreams also influenced magic and medicine. Amulets might be prescribed to ward off persistent nightmares. Specific rituals could be performed to expunge a dream, much like one would nullify a curse. For the ancient Egyptians, the sleeping mind was not passive, it was a stage where gods, demons, and the spirits of the deceased could manifest, offering glimpses into hidden truths, provided one possessed the wisdom and a priest to decipher them. Dreams as clinical appointments in ancient Greece. In the ancient Greek world, dreams were more than ethereal whispers from the divine, they were akin to clinical appointments with the gods. Central to this belief was the practice of incubation, a ritual where individuals would sleep within a temple in the hope of receiving a healing vision. And no deity was more intimately associated with this practice than Asclepius, the god of medicine. At temples known as Asclepia, which dotted the Greek landscape from Epidaurus to Pergamon, the sick, the hopeful, and the desperate sought remedies. But instead of pills or potions, they were prescribed sleep, sacred, intentional, and performed under specific spiritual conditions. Before entering the temple's sleeping quarters, or abaton, an individual would undergo a process of purification, involving bathing, fasting, and sometimes animal sacrifice. Only after these rituals could they recline on a stone bed and await the god's appearance in a dream. The reported outcomes, according to inscriptions and ancient testimonies, included patients dreaming of Asclepius touching them with his staff or of snakes, his sacred animal, slithering over their bodies. They would awaken healed, or at least convinced they had received divine instructions on their next steps. Whether these dreams were genuinely supernatural, psychosomatic, or placebo-driven, their effects were profound. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, acknowledged the value of dreams in diagnosis. They didn't dismiss them as nonsense, in fact. They believed the body could reveal its condition through symbolic visions. A dream of flowing water might suggest kidney ailments. A dream of being crushed could indicate a chest affliction. In Hippocratic texts, dreams were often categorized as either natural or divine. Natural dreams were attributed to diet, digestion, or emotional stress. Divine ones, a distinct category, were considered direct messages from the gods or the cosmos. However, not all dream interpreters wore white robes and carried scrolls. The onirocretois, or dream readers, were the true celebrities of the public square. Utilizing dream manuals, omens, and a vast reservoir of interpretive flair, they translated dreams into warnings, blessings, or instructions. The most famous of these guides was the Oneirocritica, penned by Artemidorus of Daldis in the 2nd century CE, a book that continued to be studied centuries later. In Greece, a dream wasn't merely a nocturnal experience, it was a bridge between the mortal and the divine, body and soul, illness and healing. And if you were fortunate, you'd awaken with a cure and perhaps a snake coiled at your feet. The power of prophetic dreams. Throughout the ancient world, one category of dream carried more weight than all others. The prophetic dream. These weren't just messages, they were warnings, revelations, or calls to action. For cultures spanning Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, prophetic dreams were considered sacred transmissions from a higher plane, direct links to gods, fate, or the mysterious mechanisms of the cosmos. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, prophetic dreams were a recognized and revered channel of divine communication. The Old Testament abounds with examples. Consider Joseph, son of Jacob, who dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing before his own, a powerful symbol of his future rise to power. Later, as an interpreter of Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt, he foretold 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. That single dream, of fat and thin cows, altered the course of Egypt's economy. Joseph didn't just interpret dreams. He became a national strategist by doing so. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, kings frequently received dreams that portended victory, disaster, or divine favor. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal claimed to have seen the gods in his dreams, guiding him to success in warfare and governance. Prophetic dreams were perceived as confirmation of a ruler's divine legitimacy, an essential aspect in a world where the distinction between king and deity was blurred. The Greeks, too, recognized this prophetic potential. Dreams were categorized, those arising from the subconscious were called anhypnia, while those that revealed truth were termed oniroia lithanoi. These were not taken lightly. Before major decisions, founding a city, declaring war, embarking on a voyage, Greek leaders often consulted dreams or those trained to interpret them. Dreams were so revered that they even had their own minor deities, the oniroi, winged spirits who entered the sleeper's mind with messages from the gods. Even the Romans, typically more pragmatic, treated prophetic dreams with seriousness. The Emperor Augustus is said to have dreamt of future glory, and even Nero consulted dream interpreters during his reign, perhaps not enough. Considering how that turned out. The Roman general Scipio Africanus, prior to defeating Hannibal, reportedly experienced a dream of victory sent by the spirits of his ancestors. In ancient societies, prophetic dreams weren't footnotes, they were instruments of power, tools of policy, and evidence of divine selection. The fate of nations, the health of empires, and the rise of legends often commenced with something as simple as a whispered vision in the dark. Anatolian dream incubation. A blend of traditions. While Greek Asclepian temples are the most renowned, ancient dream incubation was not exclusive to Greece. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, dream healing flourished within a rich tapestry of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions, featuring temples and sacred sites dedicated to facilitating contact with divine forces through sleep. The most captivating example stems from the cult of Men, a Phrygian lunar god associated with healing cycles and, naturally, dreams. His temples frequently sat atop hills facing the night sky, as if strategically positioned to capture lunar messages beamed into the dreams of supplicants. Individuals suffering from physical ailments, spiritual unrest, or uncertainty about their futures would journey to these shrines to practice incubation, ritual sleep undertaken with the hope of receiving a curative or guiding dream. The process mirrored Asclepian practices, but Anatolian incubation introduced its own unique elements. Worshippers would sometimes traverse labyrinthine paths or sleep beneath celestial carvings, convinced that their proximity to sacred geometry would sharpen divine messages. Music, incense, and chanting were often employed to attune the sleeper's mind to the divine frequency. This wasn't sleep for rest, it was sleep as a mode of spiritual reception. Texts from the region also allude to dream priests, spiritual specialists trained to guide and interpret these visions. Some would even seed dreams, suggesting imagery or symbols before sleep to shape the encounter. For example, someone desiring a vision of their future child might sleep with a carved fertility idol beneath their pillow. If they dreamt of a lion, the priest might declare that a brave son was on the way. If they dreamt of rain, a daughter blessed by growth and wisdom. Hittite records also chronicle divine encounters in dreams, particularly among royalty. Kings and queens received strategic counsel, healing knowledge, and occasionally stern warnings from the gods during their slumber. One dream reportedly instructed a queen to integrate a foreign goddess into her shrine. An early instance of divine diplomacy. Dream incubation in Anatolia was not merely personal, it was communal and cosmic. Pilgrims journeyed vast distances, often forming temporary healing communities. Bound not by kinship but by shared vulnerability and hope. And through sleep, they believed the gods could redirect the trajectory of their lives. In Anatolia, to dream was not a passive experience. It was an act of ritual participation where healing and prophecy flowed not from logic, but from the silent language of sleep. By the 2nd century CE, the ancient practice of dream interpretation had evolved into a refined discipline. And one individual undertook the monumental task of systematizing it all. Artemidorus of Daldis, a Greek scholar from Asia Minor, penned the Onira Critica, arguably the most exhaustive and impactful dream manual of the ancient world. Unlike enigmatic scribes who cloaked everything in divine mystery, Artemidorus approached dreams with the meticulous precision of a scholar and the astute curiosity of a streetwise psychologist. Artemidorus's comprehensive dream manual. The Onira Critica was no mere mystical pamphlet, it was a comprehensive 5-book tome, written in lucid Greek, teeming with thousands of dream scenarios and their interpretations. These were meticulously gathered from personal interviews, temple records, and public presentations. Artemidorus asserted that he dedicated decades to collecting dream accounts from individuals from all walks of life, sailors, merchants, courtesans, and soldiers. His underlying philosophy was simple. To truly comprehend the essence of a culture, one must listen to its dreams. He categorized dreams into various themes: actions, animals, professions, physiological functions, and even types of relationships. Dreaming of soaring through the air, for instance, could signify either liberation or hubris. To dream of public nudity, depending on your social standing, might denote shame or future authority. Dreaming of one's teeth falling out consistently symbolized a loss, typically of relatives, an interpretation that has remarkably persisted through the millennia. What truly distinguished Artemidorus was his emphasis on context. Unlike earlier dream books that offered rigid, static meanings, Artemidorus underscored the critical importance of the dreamer's social status, gender, occupation, and current life circumstances. A wealthy man dreaming of a shipwreck, for example, would signify business difficulties. A poor man dreaming of the same event, however, might discover new prosperity. Interpretation was not a one-size-fits-all endeavor, it was tailored, akin to early forms of psychotherapy. Artemidorus also grappled directly with symbolism. He recognized that dreams employed metaphor and irony. A dream of dying did not necessarily portend death, it could signify rebirth or renewal. A dream of sexual activity didn't always pertain to desire, it might symbolize dominance, power struggles, or guilt. His interpretations navigated a curious boundary between profound logic and astounding bizarreness. The Onira Critica was more than a mere curiosity. It served as a vital reference for centuries across the Roman and Byzantine empires. It significantly influenced medieval dream interpreters and was translated into Arabic, keeping its insights alive long after the grand classical temples had crumbled. With Artemidorus, the dream transformed into a text to be scrutinized and deciphered, not solely for prophecy, but for profound self-understanding. He may not have believed dreams originated from gods, but he certainly believed they arose from somewhere deep, peculiar, and undeniably worthy of exploration. Nightmares, terrors from the depths. Not all dreams in the ancient world were benevolent gifts from the gods. Some were terrors from the depths, dark, haunting visions believed to emanate from restless spirits, malevolent forces, or even the underworld itself. These weren't considered mere disturbed nights of sleep, they were warnings, punishments, or dire omens of future events. The Babylonians were among the first to distinguish between dreams of divine origin and those that stemmed from sinister entities. If a dream instilled fear, caused illness, or brought distress, it was deemed polluted, and a priest would be summoned to conduct apotropaic rituals, cleansing spells, offerings, or symbolic actions designed to neutralize the dream's ill effects. For instance, if someone dreamt of being pursued by a demon, the interpreter might advise sleeping with a protective amulet beneath their pillow or burning cedarwood incense to repel evil spirits. The Egyptians, too, possessed a well-developed concept of nightmare prevention. Certain dreams were thought to be caused by malevolent entities, including the spirits of the deceased. Amulets depicting the Eye of Horus or images of Bes, the dwarf god who guarded households from dark forces, were worn to protect against these assaults. Some individuals even recited dream-erasing spells upon waking, treating the nightmare as a contagious curse that needed to be verbally expunged before it could manifest in the physical world. In Greek thought, nightmares often conveyed a message not from the Olympian gods, but from chthonic deities, gods of the earth and the underworld. Hades, Persephone, and even the terrifying Erinyes, Furies, could manifest in dreams to express divine displeasure or signal an unpunished crime. Dreamers who disregarded these warnings did so at their peril. The philosopher Plato, in his Republic, even described the dream as a battleground between reason and appetite, where the lower parts of the soul ran wild. For him, the nightmare was not only a spiritual warning but also a psychological one, an indication that one's inner self was out of balance. Even the Romans, pragmatic as ever, feared dreams involving certain animals, such as owls, snakes, or wolves, as harbingers of impending death, betrayal, or war. They believed the departed could visit the living through dreams, sometimes to warn, sometimes to accuse. In every ancient culture, nightmares transcended mere bad dreams, they were regarded as cosmic red flags. Stark reminders that the seen and unseen worlds were perpetually connected, and that even in slumber, there was no true escape from fate. Dreams as political assets. In the ancient world, dreams were not merely spiritual, they were potent political assets. Rulers, priests, generals, and prophets frequently weaponized dreams to rationalize decisions, influence public opinion, or consolidate their authority. When the gods spoke in sleep, those in power were quick to declare, "They spoke to me." Consider Alexander the Great, for instance. Before his conquest of Egypt, he reportedly dreamt of the god Ammonius welcoming him as a son. Upon his arrival at the Siwa oasis, the local oracle corroborated the dream, proclaiming Alexander a divine offspring. Was the dream authentic? Was it orchestrated? It mattered little. The message solidified his rule and presented him as more than mortal, a living god in the eyes of his troops and subjects. Dreams proved especially useful during periods of political transition or uncertainty. In ancient Rome, Augustus claimed to have dreamt of a great victory at Actium, which he achieved against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Afterward, this dream was immortalized in literature and on coinage, transforming it into a sacred narrative. Later emperors followed suit. If the gods endorsed your dream, who dared to oppose your actions? Priests and oracles often facilitated this manipulation. Dream interpretation became a theological instrument, particularly when it aligned with the interests of a ruler or the temple elite. Imagine a rebellious governor who dreamt of disaster. The priest might interpret it as divine retribution for challenging imperial authority. Conversely, dreams of fruitfulness and triumph, interpreted correctly, could embolden leaders to initiate campaigns, levy taxes, or implement reforms. This practice was not limited to men. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt asserted in temple inscriptions that her birth was foretold in a dream by the god Ammonius, who appeared to her mother and prophesied her divine rulership. By framing her reign as divinely ordained in dreams, she fortified her legitimacy on a male-dominated throne. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible also employed dreams to challenge kings. Daniel, for example, interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a colossal statue, predicting the rise and fall of empires. This was not merely dream reading, it was geopolitics veiled in allegory. Across all civilizations, dreams empowered leaders to declare, "This is not merely my will, it is the will of heaven." Whether genuine divine revelation or calculated propaganda, dreams served as a powerful currency, transforming the subconscious into statecraft, one vision at a time. The enduring legacy of dream interpretation. Though the ancient temples have crumbled and the priests of dream now lie beneath layers of dust, the legacy of ancient dream interpretation persists. Whispering through time, science, and psychology. Much of what we understand today about dreams, our fascination with symbolism, recurring motifs, even nightmares, has roots in ancient frameworks that endeavored to comprehend the sleeping mind. The medieval world wholeheartedly embraced these traditions. Islamic scholars translated Artemidorus's Onira Critica into Arabic, refining and expanding upon it. In Islamic mysticism, dreams gain deep respect as a means of divine guidance. Concurrently, Christian monks and theologians began cataloging the dreams of saints and martyrs, visions that often foretold future miracles or divine justice. The fundamental structure remained. Sleep as a conduit to the sacred, dreams as veiled messages, and interpreters as the bridge between the human and the divine. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and we encounter Sigmund Freud, who, despite rejecting religious interpretations, heavily drew from the symbolic structure pioneered millennia prior. In The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899, Freud argued that dreams expressed repressed desires and fears, yet he still utilized ancient tools, metaphor, symbol, and narrative. His protégé, Carl Jung, went further, describing the dream world as populated by archetypes, universal figures like the shadow, the hero, and the wise old man. Eerily similar to figures one might encounter in a Greek temple or a Babylonian omen list. Even modern neuroscience, while stripping dreams of their mysticism, still respects their inherent complexity. Concepts like REM sleep, lucid dreaming, and the influence of trauma or memory on dream content echo ancient notions that dreams reflect both the health of the body and the state of the soul. Pop culture, too, carries on this torch. From film and literature to tarot and New Age spirituality, dreams remain a source of perpetual fascination. Whether it's a horror film based on sleep paralysis or a dream journal app promising self-discovery, the ancient idea still pulses beneath the surface. What we experience in sleep holds significance. Ultimately, the ancients may not have possessed brain scans or sleep labs, but they grasped something we still pursue today. Dreams are not random, they are stories, signals, or shadows whispered in the language of gods, ancestors, or ourselves. The question remains consistent across time: what is your dream trying to tell you? The urgent need for connection in mid-19th century America. In the mid-19th century, the United States was a nation experiencing significant growing pains. By 1860, California had been a state for a full decade, yet it frequently felt more like a distant relative than an integrated sibling. The eastern half of the country thrummed with bustling cities, burgeoning telegraph networks, and expanding railroads, while the western frontier remained rugged, isolated, and agonizingly disconnected. A letter dispatched from New York to San Francisco could take 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes longer, if adverse weather, logistical delays, or highwaymen interfered. And that was assuming it even arrived. Mail routes at the time were as convoluted as they were inefficient. The most common pathway involved ships transporting mail down the Atlantic, across the Isthmus of Panama, and then back up the Pacific coast, a journey fraught with delays, tropical illnesses, and logistical nightmares. Concurrently, the overland route via stagecoach was protracted, perilous, and frequently hampered by muddy trails, snowbound mountain passes, or assaults from outlaws and challenging terrain. This communication lag was not merely an inconvenience, it presented a significant political problem. The federal government harbored concerns that California, increasingly isolated, might drift away in spirit or loyalty. In an era where the specter of secession already loomed large, maintaining continental unity was not just an aspiration, it was an urgent imperative. Entrepreneurs and forward thinkers began proposing audacious solutions. None was bolder than the concept of establishing a central relay system utilizing the American West's most abundant resources: expansive terrain and swift equines. If adept riders could gallop across the country in shifts, exchanging horses at stations every 10 to 15 miles, perhaps, just perhaps, they could slash delivery times from several weeks to a mere 10 days. The audacious proposal of the Pony Express. It was an audacious proposition. The intended route would span nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California. It would traverse formidable mountains, arid deserts, treacherous rivers, and territories that were scarcely charted. Riders would face extreme heat, frigid nights, and the ever-present threat of ambush. However, if successful, it would forge the swiftest communication link between the East and West. The challenge was unmistakable: America was expanding at a pace that outstripped its existing infrastructure. Thus, with a blend of desperation, ambition, and sheer frontier audacity, a solution galloped into the annals of history, one saddlebag at a time. The Pony Express was on the cusp of creation. The visionaries behind the venture. The Pony Express didn't simply appear out of the dust, it was the brainchild of three ambitious businessmen from the prominent freight and stagecoach firm: Russell, Majors, and Waddell. Based in Missouri, the trio, William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, were seasoned veterans in the overland shipping industry. Their company was responsible for transporting freight and government provisions across the untamed frontier. However, in 1860, they set their sights on a far more radical objective: accelerating mail delivery to California in the shortest possible timeframe. At that juncture, Russell, in particular, was under considerable pressure. His reputation was at stake due to financial improprieties and failed ventures. He perceived the Pony Express not merely as a patriotic service but as a personal path to redemption, a means to salvage his name and curry favor with the government. If they could demonstrate the efficacy of their relay system, they aimed to secure a lucrative federal mail contract. Alexander Majors contributed the logistical acumen. A devout and meticulous planner, he demanded strict discipline from his employees, even requiring riders and station masters to take oaths against drinking and cursing. He also meticulously devised a highly structured system for the express. Stations were to be erected every 10 to 15 miles, with larger, home stations, strategically placed every 75 to 100 miles. The entire operation was to be managed with military precision. William B. Waddell, the most reserved of the three, provided the legal and financial bedrock. While Russell was the visionary salesman and Majors the operational genius, Waddell diligently managed the accounts and ensured the company remained solvent, at least for a period. Together, the three poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the undertaking. They acquired over 400 horses, hired more than 80 riders, and constructed approximately 190 stations across the most remote stretches of the frontier. They recognized the inherent gamble and the arduous nature of the route. Yet, they also understood that whoever resolved the communication crisis would secure a permanent place in American history. Consequently, without any prior government funding, they launched the service themselves. It was an audacious move, financially precarious, logistically daunting, yet profoundly symbolic of American resilience. In April of 1860, the Pony Express stood ready to embark. The race against time and unforgiving terrain had commenced. Forging the frontier route. Establishing the Pony Express route was akin to constructing a delicate bridge across a continent without a safety net and with almost zero margin for error. The full expanse covered nearly 2,000 miles, stretching from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, traversing a bewildering array of landscapes, rolling plains, imposing mountain ranges, high deserts, and perilous river crossings. To transform this audacious concept into reality, the founders erected a network of approximately 190 relay stations. Strategically spaced every 10 to 15 miles, roughly the distance a horse could gallop at full speed before exhaustion. Every 75 to 100 miles. A home station offered much-needed rest and sanctuary for the riders, where they could sleep, eat, and transfer the mail to a fresh rider. However, the true foundation of the express lay in its equines, numbering over 400 in total. They were selected not for their appearance or stature, but for their sheer speed and stamina. In the Eastern Territories, swift-footed thoroughbreds dominated the prairie. In the rugged West, compact and resilient Mustangs carried the mail across mountains and deserts. These were the Ferraris of the frontier. Riders would gallop at full speed, dismount mid-stride, and leap onto a fresh mount in a matter of mere seconds. Each station had to be staffed, provisioned, and secured. Some were modest, consisting of little more than sod huts or wooden shacks. Others were fortified structures, encircled by fencing and guarded by vigilant station keepers armed with rifles. Supplies, water, feed, and food had to be transported in advance, demanding months of meticulous preparation in some of the most remote and inhospitable regions of America. Adverse weather posed one of the greatest threats. Riders endured brutal blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, scorching sandstorms in the Utah desert, and oppressive summer heat on the Nebraska plains. Wild animals, swollen rivers, and collapsing trails were daily hazards. And then there were the human dangers, bandits, outlaws, and the escalating tensions of conflict with Native American tribes. Yet, despite the pervasive chaos, the system functioned effectively. With riders exchanging every 75 to 100 miles and fresh horses every 10 to 15 miles, the mail traversed the continent in as little as 10 days. A revolutionary speed for the era. It was a logistical marvel, woven together by courage, sheer effort, and raw determination. In a land where miles signified isolation, the Pony Express forged a fragile thread of connection, one hoofbeat at a time. The inaugural ride and its impact. On April 3, 1860, the Pony Express made its historic debut. In St. Joseph, Missouri, a throng gathered at the stables of the Pikes Peak Stables building, brimming with anticipation. The inaugural rider, most likely Johnny Fry, though historical records are somewhat disputed, mounted his horse, received the leather mochila, a specially designed mail pouch, and galloped off westward at a blistering pace. The crowd roared, cannons fired, and just like that, a new chapter in American history thundered to life. The mailbag Fry carried weighed approximately 20 pounds, filled with letters, newspapers, and telegrams destined for California. A telegraph message had already been transmitted from Washington, D.C. and would now complete its journey on horseback, symbolizing the fusion of nascent technology and raw human endeavor. Simultaneously, a counterpart in Sacramento commenced an eastbound ride, initiating the bidirectional relay. Between them lay nearly 2,000 miles of untamed wilderness, 190 stations, and some of the most challenging terrain North America had to offer. And they intended to conquer it in a mere 10 days. Each rider on the route carried the mochila from one station to the next, dismounting a lathered horse and leaping onto a fresh one in under 2 minutes. The mochila was ingeniously designed, featuring 4 locked pouches, and could be swiftly transferred over the saddle horn without needing to unstrap anything. Speed was paramount. Riders were expected to maintain an average pace of 10 miles per hour. Even in the dead of night, through rain, snow, or hostile territory. Despite the inherent chaos, the maiden ride was a resounding success. The mail from Missouri reached Sacramento in 9 days and 23 hours, a triumph. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of modern communication, and the legend of the Pony Express was born almost overnight. Though only a handful of letters occupied that initial mochila, the symbolic impact was immeasurable. It wasn't merely about transporting mail from point A to point B. It was about demonstrating possibility, about proving that this wild, fragmented continent could be united, that human determination and equine prowess could outpace isolation. For the riders, it marked the genesis of a dangerous, exhilarating chapter. For the nation, it offered a glimpse into something revolutionary, instant communication, faster than anyone had ever imagined possible. The West had just shrunk a little. The courageous riders. The lifeblood of the Pony Express wasn't solely the horses, the stations, or even the mochila. It was the riders, a cadre of young, lean daredevils who defied inclement weather, untamed wilderness, and escalating conflict to deliver the mail. They were more than mere couriers, they were living legends in the making. The typical Pony Express rider was no older than 18, often closer to 16. They were lightweight, usually under 125 pounds, to minimize the burden on their horses. Speed and endurance were paramount. The now famous recruitment advertisements purportedly read, "Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows, not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred." While the exact wording is likely apocryphal, the spirit behind it was absolutely authentic. These young men rode 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses at every station, but never resting until they had transferred the mochila to the next rider. They frequently rode at night, through torrential rain, blizzards, or scorching heat. They carried revolvers and rifles. But against bandits or hostile attacks, their most effective defense was sheer speed. Many of them traveled alone and often unarmed, relying entirely on their ability to outrun trouble. Some riders ascended to folk hero status. Pony Bob Haslam once rode an astonishing 380 miles in under 2 days to deliver mail during a violent Paiute uprising, despite being wounded by arrows. William "Buffalo Bill" Cody, who later achieved fame as a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at the tender age of 15. Though historians continue to debate the accuracy of that particular tale. Regardless, the reality was already dramatic enough. Riders had to navigate the formidable Rocky Mountains, traverse the vast Great Basin desert, and brave territories where the slightest misstep could result in freezing to death, drowning, or vanishing without a trace. And yet, the service maintained an astonishing reliability rate. Even in the harshest conditions, only one mochila was ever lost. Despite the pervasive danger, many riders genuinely relished the job. They were compensated generously for the era, earning $100 to $150 per month, a small fortune for a teenager. They savored the thrill, the speed, and the profound sense of purpose. They weren't just delivering mail, they were actively stitching the country together. The riders of the Pony Express were more than mere messengers, they were enduring symbols of American courage, endurance, and tenacity, galloping through myth and memory with every hoofbeat. And for 18 unforgettable months, they unequivocally proved that no frontier was too vast to traverse. The perils of the ride. Riding for the Pony Express was more than just a job, it was a daily gamble with death. The riders faced a relentless gauntlet of perils that would have compelled most seasoned adults to retreat. Yet, these predominantly teenage boys pressed forward through the raw fury of nature, against armed adversaries, and across a land that often seemed determined to swallow them whole. One of the most persistent threats originated from the environment itself. Riders braved howling blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, endured blistering heat across the Nevada desert, and navigated sudden thunderstorms that could transform river crossings into treacherous torrents or turn dirt paths into impassable mire. Slipping off a horse in freezing conditions could lead to hypothermia. One wrong move in a swollen river could result in drowning, and many riders came perilously close. Then there were the animals. Packs of wolves occasionally pursued riders at night. Rattlesnakes lay coiled in the trailside brush, and stealthy mountain lions stalked the high passes. But even more dangerous than the wildlife were the bandits and bushwhackers who understood that a rider's mochila contained valuable letters, some even laced with gold dust or containing money orders. Though the riders carried revolvers, they were often outnumbered, and pausing meant jeopardizing both their lives and their crucial mission. Tensions with Native American tribes also escalated during the Pony Express's relatively brief existence. The Paiute War in 1860, ignited by grievances over land, broken agreements, and encroaching settlers, resulted in several assaults on Pony Express stations. Riders faced ambushes, station keepers were killed, and multiple stations were razed. The most renowned incident involved Pony Bob Haslam, who galloped nearly 190 miles through hostile territory to deliver the mail, sustaining arrow wounds but completing his route regardless. Overcoming isolation and danger. Even isolation presented a danger. Riders were alone, often for hours, with only their horse, their weapon, and the encroaching darkness for company. A broken leg, an injured horse, or a missed station could mean perishing alone in the vast wilderness, never to be found. And yet, they rode on. Despite all these adversities, the system endured. Mail was occasionally delayed, but rarely lost. Riders were sometimes wounded, but they almost invariably completed their perilous journeys. In 18 months of operation, only a handful of men lost their lives on the job. The Pony Express was no romanticized fantasy of the Wild West, it was a brutal, often terrifying reality. But by surviving these dangers, the riders forged their legends, demonstrating that even the most unforgiving terrain could be subdued, if only long enough to deliver the mail. The profound impact of the Pony Express. Although the Pony Express operated for a mere 18 months, its influence on the United States was immediate, far-reaching, and undeniably profound. In a nation teetering on the brink of civil war and desperately yearning for a sense of unity across its vast expanse, the Express unequivocally proved one thing: distance was no longer destiny. Before the Pony Express, it took weeks for letters to travel from the East Coast to California. Crucial political decisions, vital commercial agreements, and personal correspondence often arrived too late to be relevant. But with the Express, mail could reach San Francisco in just 10 days. Suddenly, Californians were no longer out of sync with the rest of the country. Businesses grew bolder, newspapers could report near real-time updates from across the nation, and families felt more connected. Most importantly, the Union felt more unified, a fact that would become critically important as the Civil War loomed. Politically, the Express also reassured the federal government that the West was within reach. It symbolized national strength and cohesion at a time when fragmentation felt dangerously close. President James Buchanan received regular updates from California during the tense months leading up to Lincoln's election, partly thanks to the Express. Economically, it helped lay the groundwork for transcontinental infrastructure. The stations constructed across remote territories became future sites for railroads, telegraph lines, and stagecoach routes. Many Pony Express routes would later be absorbed into more permanent communication systems. What was once a daring gamble became the blueprint for how America would ultimately connect itself from coast to coast. Culturally, the Pony Express became the quintessential embodiment of the frontier spirit. Newspapers romanticized the riders, creating instant heroes. Young men across the country dreamt of taking the reins. galloping through danger with a saddlebag brimming with destiny. The express became mythologized even as it operated, capturing the imagination of a nation eager for symbols of courage and unity. Even after its cessation, the Pony Express continued to shape American identity. It represented speed, bravery, sacrifice, and, above all, possibility. In just over a year, it managed to achieve what steamships, Congress, and diplomacy had failed to do: make a fractured, sprawling nation feel like one cohesive entity. The Pony Express didn't just deliver mail. It delivered the future, one gallop at a time. The demise of the Pony Express. For all its daring and triumph, the Pony Express was, in essence, doomed from its inception. It wasn't a question of operational failure, it was a matter of advancing technology. As swift as a horse could gallop, nothing could rival the instantaneous speed of a wire. Just 2 days after the Pony Express officially launched in April 1860, construction commenced on the transcontinental telegraph. A coast-to-coast communication system that would transmit messages in mere minutes rather than days. The telegraph poles and lines steadily advanced westward from the Missouri River and eastward from California. Every mile of strong wire signaled another nail in the express's coffin. By October 24, 1861, precisely 18 months after its inaugural ride, the final telegraph wire was strung across the country. The system went live, and the connection was instantaneous. That very same day, the Pony Express carried its last letter. The thunderous silence of hoofbeats was replaced by the rhythmic click of Morse code. But even before the telegraph's completion, the Pony Express was hemorrhaging money. Despite its legendary performance, it was a commercial disaster. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had invested over $700,000 into the operation and barely recouped a fraction of that amount. With no federal subsidy and exorbitant operational costs, horses, riders, station upkeep, and supply logistics, the Express was never a sustainable business model. It was conceived as a proof of concept, a bold advertisement for a federal mail contract that never fully materialized. Russell himself faced significant financial scandal, and the company began to crumble. By the time the telegraph was completed, the Express was already on its last legs, heroic, beloved, but utterly obsolete. Yet, its end came with little bitterness. The very objective the Pony Express set out to demonstrate, that rapid coast-to-coast communication was indeed possible, had been achieved. Riders transitioned to other frontier occupations. Stations were repurposed or abandoned, and the nation turned its gaze toward the future. The cessation of the Pony Express was not a failure, it was a passing of the torch. The horse gave way to the wire, just as the wire would later yield to radio waves, satellites, and the Internet. But for one brief, brilliant moment, America watched in awe as teenage boys and powerful horses conquered time and distance. In a world obsessed with velocity, the Pony Express galloped into legend, leaving hoof prints no telegraph wire could ever erase. The enduring mythology of the Pony Express. Though it operated for only 18 months, the Pony Express galloped straight into the mythology of the American West, becoming one of the most enduring and romanticized narratives in the nation's history. In reality, it was a precarious, short-lived business venture. But in the public imagination, it transformed into something far greater, a symbol of heroism, lightning speed, and the relentless frontier spirit. Hollywood, dime novels, and school textbooks meticulously crafted the Express into legend. The iconic image of a lone rider silhouetted against the setting sun, thundering across the prairie with a leather mail pouch and a revolver at his side, captivated the nation's heart. This wasn't merely nostalgia, it was national identity in motion. At a time when America was still defining its character, the Pony Express offered a story of bravery, sacrifice, and unity forged through hardship. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo Bill Cody became frontier celebrities. Cody, regardless of the historical accuracy of his claims of writing for the Express, skillfully capitalized on the legend in his Wild West shows, firmly embedding the image of the fearless teenage courier in the minds of millions worldwide. The Express became shorthand for grit, daring, and everything Americans wished to believe about their pioneer past. Monuments soon followed. Statues of galloping riders now adorn cities along the old trail, from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and bike paths trace segments of the original route. Reenactments, museum exhibits, and historical tours keep the memory vibrantly alive. Even the U.S. Postal Service has issued Pony Express stamps, honoring the brief but bold endeavor that helped unite the nation. But the story endures for a deeper reason. The Pony Express reminds us of a pivotal moment in history when human endurance raced neck and neck with nature's formidable obstacles. When communication entailed significant risk and connection demanded immense courage. It tells us that speed once originated not from satellites but from sheer determination and an unwavering willingness to ride through snow, desert, and darkness with nothing but a horse and a dream. In our contemporary age of instant messages and global networks, it's easy to forget just how challenging communication once was. The Pony Express stands as a profound tribute to those who bridged impossible distances, not with fiber optics or electricity, but with muscle, grit, and a pounding heartbeat. Its legend persists not because it lasted, but because for a brief and shining moment, it outran the impossible. The genesis of beer. Ancient Mesopotamia. The earliest known beer didn't arrive in a frosty mug or a labeled bottle. It emerged from a clay pot in the heart of a Sumerian village thousands of years ago. Long before the rise of Rome or the erection of the pyramids, the people of ancient Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerians, were brewing beer in ways that were both elemental and sacred. And they weren't merely consuming it, they were revering it. Beer in Sumerian society wasn't just a casual beverage, it was a fundamental foodstuff, a medium of exchange, a religious offering, and a potent symbol of civilization itself. It's no coincidence that the oldest written recipe in human history is not for bread or soup, but for beer. Discovered on clay tablets dating back to around 1800 BCE, the hymn to Ninkasi extols the goddess of beer while simultaneously outlining brewing instructions in poetic verse. Ninkasi was no minor deity, she was deeply revered. To brew beer was to invoke her very presence. The brewing process was both practical and poetic. Sumerians would bake a special bread called bapper, crafted from barley and often blended with honey or dates. This bread was then crumbled into jars of water and allowed to ferment naturally. The resulting concoction bore little resemblance to modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, more akin to a nutritious gruel. And it was indispensable to daily life. Water in the ancient world was frequently contaminated, but beer, thanks to its fermentation process, was a safer alternative. It was rich in calories and essential nutrients, becoming a vital part of the diet for laborers, priests, and royalty alike. Workers on temple construction projects or irrigation ditches were frequently compensated with beer rations, which could amount to several liters per day. Socially, beer was a communal experience. Rather than drinking from individual mugs, people often gathered around large ceramic vessels and drank through long reed straws, filtering out the sediment. It wasn't solely about intoxication, it was about fostering camaraderie, ensuring survival, and even honoring the gods. In many respects, beer helped define what it meant to be Sumerian. It was embedded in rituals, legal codes, agricultural practices, and economics. It was liquid civilization, both a daily necessity and a sacred act, and it set the stage for brewing cultures across the ancient world. Egyptian beer. Industrialization and sacred significance. From the banks of the Tigris to the shores of the Nile, if the Sumerians provided beer with its spiritual inception, the Egyptians industrialized it. By the time the Old Kingdom was flourishing along the Nile, beer had transcended its status as a mere sacred drink, it had become a cornerstone of Egyptian society. Intricately woven into everything from daily meals to divine offerings and funeral rites. Egyptian beer was brewed on a scale that dwarfed earlier methods. In large temple and palace complexes, massive breweries operated as an integral part of the state economy. In fact, beer production was often overseen by religious institutions. The Egyptians believed beer was a divine gift from Osiris, the god of agriculture and fertility, and it featured prominently in ceremonies honoring deities such as Hathor, the goddess of music, fertility, and joy, frequently associated with intoxication. And R.A. The brewing process was similar to that of the Sumerians but had evolved in both technique and scale. Bread made from emmer wheat or barley was partially baked, crumbled into large vats, and mixed with water. Dates or honey were added for sweetness, and the mixture was left to ferment in ceramic jars. The resulting beverage was thick, unfiltered, and highly nutritious, sometimes consumed with a spoon rather than merely sipped. Beer wasn't solely for the living. Tombs were furnished with jars of beer for the afterlife, alongside loaves of bread and meat. Beer was considered so essential that no respectable journey to the next world could be conceived without it. Recipes for the deceased. Meticulous lists of beer offerings to the gods, and vibrant murals depicting the brewing process all underscore its profound spiritual weight. But beer also fueled the labor economy. The workers who constructed the pyramids were not slaves, they were paid laborers, and a portion of their daily rations included beer, sometimes up to 4 liters per day. This wasn't an indulgence. It provided hydration, nutrition, and boosted morale, all in one. One archaeologist even famously referred to it as the ancient Egyptian energy drink. The state maintained strict control over production and distribution. Taxes were levied in beer, and its quality was rigorously regulated. Women, particularly priestesses and temple workers, were often involved in brewing, reinforcing its connection to both domestic life and sacred power. In essence, beer in Egypt was not a peripheral item, it was central. It nourished the populace, pleased the gods, and filled the tombs. And like the Nile itself, it flowed through every facet of Egyptian life. Beer as divine communion across ancient cultures, across ancient civilizations. Beer was far more than a mere beverage, it was a profound form of divine communion. Its frothy presence was invited into temples, funeral rites, and festive celebrations. Fermentation was not viewed as a simple chemical process but as a mystical transformation, a sacred gift from the gods that transmuted humble grain into hallowed liquid. To brew beer was to engage with the spiritual world, and to partake of it was to share in something beyond mere sustenance. In Sumer, the goddess Ninkasi embodied this connection. Her hymn served as both prayer and instruction, an act of devout worship and a practical guide for sacred brewing. Rituals likely commenced with chants to invoke her presence before the fermentation process began. It's plausible that the finished beer was shared as part of temple offerings, distributed to priests, and even poured out in libations to the gods themselves. In Egypt, the spiritual application of beer was even more deeply woven into the religious fabric. Temples brewed their own beer for daily offerings, sometimes dedicating hundreds of jars at a time. During the annual festival of drunkenness, worshippers commemorated the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction, who was deceived into imbibing beer stained red to mimic blood. The outcome, her bloodlust was quelled, and humanity was spared. It's a potent narrative illustrating how beer was literally regarded as a force capable of pacifying divine wrath. Beer in religious and social life. Priests and priestesses actively participated in the brewing process, and numerous religious texts cited specific ritual brews intended for ceremonies. The presence of beer in funerary rites was also crucial, it was believed to sustain the soul on its arduous journey to the afterlife. Some tomb inscriptions even meticulously list precise beer offerings alongside prayers and hymns. Beyond the temple walls, seasonal festivals frequently entailed large-scale communal drinking. These were not mere casual gatherings, they were acts of communion between the human and divine realms. Whether celebrating a bountiful harvest, honoring the deceased, or marking a solstice, beer helped to blur the lines between the mundane and the mystical. Even in later civilizations, such as the Hebrews or the Hittites, beer retained its spiritual undertones. While wine gained prominence in elite rituals, beer remained intimately connected to fertility, the earth, and the working class, upholding its ancient role as a sacred and grounding force. In the ancient world, consuming beer wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was about aligning oneself with cosmic rhythms, with deities, nature, and the perpetual cycle of life and death. Beer as a catalyst for civilization. Beer, perhaps more than any other beverage, may have been a primary driver of civilization itself. Some historians and archaeologists now contend that the impetus to brew beer was one of the pivotal forces behind early agriculture and permanent human settlements. While grain was undoubtedly cultivated for bread, the compelling possibility that humans began tilling cereals partly to produce beer is garnering increasing academic support. If accurate, beer isn't just a byproduct of civilization, it stands as one of its fundamental pillars. In ancient Mesopotamia, where organized farming first took root, evidence suggests that barley, one of the earliest domesticated grains, was prized not solely for sustenance but for its fermentable sugars. Once harvested, barley could be stored, milled, and utilized in both bread and beer production. Crucially, unlike water, which was often contaminated, fermented beer was safe for consumption and could be stored for extended periods. This made it indispensable for nascent communities, especially in arid or semi-arid regions with unreliable water sources. Beer production also necessitated a significant degree of social organization. Brewing required specialized tools, dedicated storage vessels, controlled temperatures, and precise timing. This encouraged a division of labor, fostered technological innovation, and even spurred early scientific inquiry. Clay tablets demonstrate that ancient brewers possessed a sufficient understanding of fermentation processes to consistently replicate them, no small feat in an age devoid of thermometers or commercial yeast packets. In urban centers like Uruk and Babylon, breweries became integrated into state and temple economies. Rations of beer were distributed to laborers, soldiers, and bureaucrats. Taxes could be levied in grain or beer. And because beer was intrinsically linked to both the economy and religious practices, its production was rigorously monitored and regulated. This meant that brewing directly contributed to the emergence of bureaucracy, meticulous record-keeping, and standardized weights and measures. Beer was also instrumental in the expansion of trade networks. Regions with surplus grain and brewing expertise exchanged beer, ingredients, and brewing implements with neighboring cultures. Ceramic jars containing residues of barley-based brews have been discovered at trade sites as far afield as the Levant and Egypt, indicating that fermented beverages were a valuable commodity worthy of transport. In essence, beer facilitated human settlement, organization, and prosperity. It energized workers, interconnected cities, supported religious rituals, and justified widespread grain cultivation. The frothy beverage was far more than a simple treat, it was liquid infrastructure, laying the foundation of the ancient world one sip at a time. The female domain of ancient brewing. Long before breweries became industrialized or recipes were meticulously documented, beer was predominantly the domain of women. In many ancient cultures, brewing was not a male-dominated profession but a household art practiced almost exclusively by females. Far from being a mundane kitchen chore, brewing was regarded as a sacred and highly skilled craft, often passed down from mother to daughter like a cherished heirloom recipe. In Sumerian society, beer was so deeply intertwined with femininity that even the goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, was female. This wasn't merely symbolic. It mirrored the reality that Sumerian women were the primary brewers in both domestic and temple contexts. Brewing and baking were often performed in tandem, and in the earliest periods, both involved fermentation. While men typically oversaw politics and trade, women were responsible for producing the food and drink that sustained the household and, by extension, society. In Egypt, women continued to dominate brewing, particularly within the home. Beer was crafted in clay vessels using lightly baked loaves of grain, water, and various flavorings. The process was labor-intensive but routine. Many women brewed daily or weekly, not only for family consumption but also for sale or trade in local markets. In more affluent households, female servants or workers managed smaller-scale breweries. Tomb paintings and hieroglyphs frequently depict women brewing, straining, and storing beer, underscoring their central role in this vital aspect of life. Women were also heavily involved in brewing for temples and religious rituals. Priestesses and temple workers often supervised sacred batches intended for offerings or religious festivals. In some regions, being a brewer was a source of social standing and spiritual influence. These women were not simply cooks, they were custodians of divine tradition. Over time, as societies became more stratified and beer underwent commercialization, men gradually began to dominate public brewing. However, in the earliest chapters of beer's history, women held the reins. They developed the methods, managed the ingredients, and safeguarded the essential knowledge. Interestingly, echoes of this tradition persisted into the medieval period. In Europe, many early brewers were alewives, women who produced and sold ale from their homes. Some wore tall hats to be easily seen in the marketplace, a detail that would later be distorted into the stereotypical image of a witch. But in the ancient world, a woman with a brewing pot wasn't viewed with suspicion, she was deeply respected. She nourished both gods and mortals, one bubbling jar at a time. The craft of ancient brewing. Ancient brewing wasn't simply a matter of luck or magic, it was a craft meticulously refined over generations, blending keen observation, practical experimentation, and environmental knowledge. While each culture had its unique variations, the fundamental principles of brewing were remarkably consistent: grain, water, fermentation, and time. But the specifics, that's where it becomes truly fascinating. The primary grain used across much of the ancient world was barley, though emmer wheat was also common, particularly in Egypt. These grains were chosen not only for their availability but because they naturally contained the sugars and enzymes necessary for fermentation. Grains were typically partially malted, soaked in water and allowed to germinate slightly, then either ground into a mash or baked into specialized loaves of bread specifically intended for brewing. In both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, these bread loaves, often called bapar in Sumerian, were crumbled into large ceramic vats filled with water. The mixture was stirred, sometimes briefly boiled, and then left to ferment. Natural yeast from the ambient air or from the vessels themselves initiated the fermentation process. No one understood what yeast truly was, but they knew it worked and that certain vessels yielded better beer, likely because they harbored residual yeast colonies. To sweeten or flavor the beer, brewers incorporated dates, honey, herbs, or spices. Egyptian beer, in particular, was often thick and sweet, almost resembling a liquid porridge. Filtering was optional, some versions were consumed with straws to avoid sediment, while others were so nutritious that beer was considered a meal in itself, especially for laborers and the impoverished. Temperature played a crucial role. In hot climates like Egypt and Mesopotamia, brewers carefully timed their work and utilized cool storage pits or shaded courtyards to manage the environment. In some cases, beer was aged in sealed clay jars, while in others, it was intended for immediate consumption. Brewing tools included large clay vessels, wooden paddles, woven sieves, and occasionally stone hearths for heating. Everything was handmade, and every batch possessed subtle variations. However, the accumulated knowledge was passed down orally or ritually, preserved through repetition, song, and prayer, much like the hymn to Ninkasi. Far from being primitive, ancient brewing techniques were sophisticated adaptations to local climates, available grains, and cultural preferences. They reflect not just culinary skill but an intimate relationship with nature, and transformation, a kind of alchemy where grain and water became a sacred, social elixir. Beer as currency and economic engine. As beer became central to daily life, its role expanded far beyond the household or temple. In many ancient civilizations, beer was not merely a beverage. It was currency, commodity, and an economic engine. From workers' wages to state taxes, beer was directly woven into the very fabric of ancient commerce. In Mesopotamia, beer was a key component of the ration system. Workers, including builders, farmers, and even scribes, received daily portions of beer as part of their standard compensation. The quantity and quality varied according to rank. Higher officials received more refined beer, while laborers consumed thicker, coarser varieties. Detailed cuneiform tablets meticulously list these allocations, and thousands of ancient receipts document beer transactions, proof that it was as vital as silver or grain in the economic ecosystem. Beer production itself evolved into a professional trade. Breweries, often affiliated with temples or large estates, required a small army of laborers, grain collectors, millers, bakers, fermenters, and transporters. Some regions specialized in beer production, creating distinctive regional styles and establishing localized trade routes. These beers weren't bottled and shipped as they are today, but they could be transported in ceramic jars sealed with wax or cloth. Traders bartered beer for other goods like wool, pottery, and olive oil. In Egypt, the situation was similar. Beer was produced on an enormous scale in both urban centers and rural estates. Breweries were frequently attached to state granaries, and their output supported workers, soldiers, and temple activities. Beer was taxed, meticulously tracked, and stockpiled like any strategic resource. During periods of hardship, beer even served as a bartering tool in place of scarce currency. Beer also played a role in long-distance trade. Clay vessels with residues of barley-based brews have been discovered as far apart as the Levant, Cyprus, and Nubia, suggesting that fermented beverages were exchanged alongside luxury items. While wine would eventually dominate elite markets, beer remained the people's drink. Embedded in every transaction from village markets to temple distributions, its portability and perishability made beer a uniquely local economic product, but one with national significance. Its production supported farmers, artisans, merchants, and priests alike. It was both daily sustenance and a pillar of state infrastructure. In short, ancient beer wasn't just consumed. It was counted, traded, stored, and spent. It helped construct pyramids, fund temples, and sustain empires. A mug of beer may have cost a few copper coins, but behind it lay a microcosm of civilization. Beer and social hierarchy. In the ancient world, beer was the great equalizer, everyone drank it. However, not everyone drank the same kind. Just as with food, clothing, and language, beer both reflected and reinforced the rigid social hierarchies of the time. While commoners sipped thick, hearty brews primarily for survival, the elites transformed beer into a potent status symbol, a ritual offering, and at times, even a political instrument. Among the Sumerians and Akkadians, laborers received daily beer rations. Their brews were dark, unfiltered, and dense, more akin to a thick stew than a clear beverage, but incredibly nourishing. These were functional beers, designed to sustain workers in hot, arid conditions. Yet, even within this context, there was variation. Some tablets mention at least 9 distinct types of beer, ranked by quality and purpose. The more refined versions were often reserved for scribes, priests, or administrators, demonstrating that beer was already being used to delineate class distinctions. In Egypt, the contrast was even starker. While everyday Egyptians consumed a thick beer made from emmer wheat and flavored with dates, the wealthy savored refined brews, lighter, sweeter, and sometimes filtered. Tomb paintings depict nobles with elegant goblets of golden beer, seated beneath palm fronds, while servants poured from ornate jars. For the upper classes, beer was not merely sustenance. It was an aesthetic experience. Pharaohs and their families received daily beer offerings, often alongside wine and bread. These libations were not mere tradition, they reflected power. Only the affluent could afford dedicated brewing staff, access to the finest ingredients, and the leisure to enjoy beer recreationally rather than relying on it for its caloric content. Beer also fulfilled diplomatic and ceremonial functions. During feasts, treaty negotiations, or religious festivals, offering high-quality beer signaled wealth and respect. Failing to offer it could be perceived as an insult. Interestingly, the brewing profession itself mirrored this social divide. In homes and villages, women or enslaved individuals typically brewed the family's supply. However, in temples or elite households, professional brewers, sometimes highly trained and salaried, managed production. The beer that flowed from temple vats was better regulated, more heavily taxed, and carried greater political significance. So, while beer was a universal beverage, its taste, texture, and deeper meaning varied wildly depending on one's social standing. For some, it was daily fuel; for others, it was an expression of divinity, wealth, and refinement. In every jar, ancient beer carried not just flavor but a quiet signature of social status, foaming at the rim. The enduring legacy of ancient brewing. Though thousands of years have elapsed since Sumerian priestesses chanted to Ninkasi or Egyptian laborers sipped beer beneath the shadows of pyramids, the legacy of ancient brewing continues to thrive in our recipes, rituals, economies, and collective cultural memory. Beer, perhaps more than any other beverage, connects us intrinsically to the earliest expressions of human civilization. Modern brewing owes an immense debt to the ancient world. Many techniques we now take for granted, malting grain, fermenting with wild yeast, flavoring with herbs or fruit, were ingeniously pioneered by brewers who lacked microscopes or thermometers. Instead, they relied on intuition, long-standing tradition, and tireless trial and error, guided by oral wisdom and spiritual reverence. These rudimentary methods formed the bedrock of what would eventually evolve into scientific brewing in later eras. The ancient attitude toward beer also persists in numerous cultural traditions. In regions like Ethiopia, Peru, and rural Eastern Europe, communities still brew beer in ceramic vessels, often adhering to age-old recipes passed down through generations, echoes of Sumerian and Egyptian kitchens. In these places, brewing is not merely a hobby or a commercial enterprise. It is a ritual of community, just as it was 5,000 years ago. The symbolic power of beer has also endured. Festivals, holidays, and social gatherings worldwide still feature beer as a central offering, a drink of celebration, communal bonding, and identity. Even the communal pint at a contemporary pub carries the same spirit as the ancient Sumerian clay pot shared by reed straws, beer as a bridge between people. Academically, the study of ancient brewing has sparked a growing field known as bioarchaeology. Utilizing residue analysis, scientists have meticulously reconstructed ancient beer recipes, brewed them, and even marketed them commercially. Experimental archaeology projects have successfully produced beer from ancient Egyptian tomb recipes, offering modern individuals a literal taste of history. Perhaps most importantly, ancient beer reminds us that civilization wasn't solely built on conquest, stone, or steel. It was also painstakingly built in kitchens and breweries, by ordinary people who transformed grain and water into sustenance, economic activity, and culture. It was crafted by women, consumed by laborers, and offered to gods. So the next time you raise a glass, remember you're not just drinking a beverage. You're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most universal rituals, a legacy brewed over millennia and still fermenting in every corner of the world.